Asterisk, asterisk, January 1942. A cramped radio interception room on the windswept cliffs of Station HYPO. Deep beneath the administration building at Pearl Harbor. Asterisk, asterisk. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and salt spray that seeped through concrete walls, still scarred by the attack just weeks before. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort sat hunched over sheets of paper covered in 5-digit number groups. His red smoking jacket, a peculiar uniform violation, wore in the perpetual chill of the basement draped over his shoulders like a scholar's robe. Around him, typewriters clattered in irregular percussion. The sound of pencils scratching paper mixed with the low hum of ventilation fans that never quite cleared the fog of exhaustion and tobacco. Outside, the Pacific sun beat down on a harbor still bleeding oil from sunken battleships. Inside, in this windowless cave of concrete and desperation, a different kind of war was being waged, one fought with pencils, paper, and the abstract violence of pure intellect. The men in this room did not carry rifles. They did not storm beaches or pilot fighters through flak-darkened skies. They sat, they listened, they thought, and in the months following December 7th, they began to understand that the Japanese Imperial Navy, despite its crushing victories across the Pacific, despite its carriers that seemed to strike wherever they wished, with impunity, despite the aura of invincibility that surrounded the Kido, Butitha First Air Fleet that had humiliated America at Pearl Harbor was speaking, constantly speaking, broadcasting thousands upon thousands of encrypted messages through the ether, convinced that their secrets remained hidden behind an impenetrable wall of mathematical complexity. The Japanese had placed absolute faith in a cipher machine they called the Type B cipher machine, which American intelligence had designated with a name that would become legendary. JN-25.2 comprehend what happened in the months between Pearl Harbor and Midway is to understand a transformation. It's profound that it would alter not merely the course of a single battle, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The Japanese officers who planned operations in early 1942 operated under an assumption so fundamental to their worldview that it colored every strategic decision. Their communications were secure. This was not mere hope or wishful thinking. It was mathematical certainty, or so they believed. The JN-25 cipher employed a complexity that seemed unbreakable messages encoded first, through a substitution system using a codebook containing approximately 45,000 5-digit numerical groups, then super-encrypted using additive tables that changed these numbers into different 5-digit groups. The number of possible keys ran into astronomical figures. Japanese naval cryptographers, among the finest mathematical minds their empire could muster, had assured their commanders that breaking this system within any useful time frame was impossible. American cryptanalysis, they believed, was a decade behind Japanese sophistication. This belief allowed Japanese admirals to transmit operational orders with a freedom that now seems breathtaking in its naivety. Fleet movements, rendezvous coordinates, attack timings, aircraft loadings. Commander assignments, all of it flowed through radio waves and encrypted bursts that the Japanese assumed were as secure as locked vaults. They did not know that in Melbourne, in Washington, in Ceylon, and most importantly in that basement at Pearl Harbor, teams of cryptanalysts were slowly, methodically, exhaustingly peeling back the layers of JN-25. They did not know that every message they sent was being intercepted, cataloged, analyzed. They did not know that the very volume of their communications, the bureaucratic verbosity of a navy that documented everything, was providing the statistical foundation that would lead to their unraveling. Asterisk, asterisk, the Japanese naval officers of 1941 had sailed to war wrapped in a certainty born from a decade of victories. Asterisk. Asterisk. Manchuria had fallen before their armies. China's coasts belonged to them. Indochina had been acquired without firing a shot. When they struck Pearl Harbor, they had achieved in 2 hours what most military planners thought impossible: the crippling of an entire enemy battleship fleet in harbor. When they advanced into the Philippines, into the Dutch East Indies, into Malaya and Singapore, resistance crumbled. British battleships sank beneath Japanese bombs. The fortress of Singapore, supposedly impregnable, surrendered in what Churchill would call the worst disaster in British military history. The carriers of the Kido Butai seemed to operate with supernatural prescience, appearing without warning to devastate enemy positions before vanishing back into the Pacific immensity. This string of triumphs created a psychological atmosphere within the Imperial Navy that bordered on mysticism. There developed a sense that the gods themselves favored Japanese arms, that destiny had ordained their expansion, that the decadent Western powers soft from luxury, weakened by democracy's endless debates, could not stand against the purified will of the emperor's warriors. Japanese planning documents from this period reveal an almost casual assumption of American inferiority. Intelligence assessments described American sailors as poorly trained, American commanders as predictable and unimaginative, American resolve as brittle and likely to shatter after a few defeats. The notion that these same Americans might be reading Japanese operational orders in real time, not just reading them, but reading them before some Japanese subordinate commanders received them, was literally inconceivable to most Japanese officers, yet the reality unfolding in those basement rooms told a different story entirely. The Americans who broke JN-25 were not the caricatures of Japanese propaganda. Men like Rochefort, who had studied Japanese for 3 years in Tokyo during the 1920s, who understood not just the language but the culture, the military bureaucracy, the subtle hierarchies of phrasing that indicated whether a message came from a staff officer or a fleet commander. Men like Thomas Dyer and Wesley Wright, mathematicians who approached cipher breaking with the systematic patience of scientists conducting experiments, building tables of frequency analysis, identifying patterns in the random seeming number groups. Women like Agnes Driscoll, pioneering cryptanalyst, whose techniques for strip analysis had laid groundwork for attacking Japanese systems years before the war began. These people worked 20-hour shifts. They survived on coffee and sandwiches brought down from the mess halls. They slept on cots, pushed against basement walls, catching 3 or 4 hours before returning to their desks. Their eyes ached from studying columns of numbers under fluorescent lights. Their fingers cramped from manipulating paper strips covered with cipher groups. Some suffered nervous breakdowns from the pressure. The work demanded a peculiar form of genius, not the flash of inspiration, but the grinding persistence to try thousands of combinations, to spot patterns in apparent randomness, to hold vast matrices of information in working memory, testing hypotheses that might prove fruitless after hours of calculation. By March 1942, Station HYPO was recovering roughly 15% of JN-25 traffic. 15% sounds minimal, but intelligence is not an all-or-nothing proposition. Even partial breaks yielded extraordinary insight. A message might be 85% opaque, but that remaining 15% could contain gold. A date, location designator, a ship name, a reference to aircraft types, or fuel quantities. Rochefort's team became experts at inference, at reconstructing full pictures from fragmentary evidence. They built elaborate filing systems, thousands of index cards cross-referenced by indicator groups, by message origination points, by cribs, those repeated phrases that appeared in stereotyped military communications. Your message number ... acknowledge receipt. Proceeding is ordered ... These bureaucratic formalities, which Japanese radio operators included out of habit and protocol, became the handholds by which American cryptanalysts climbed deeper into the system. Asterisk, what the Japanese expected was secrecy. What they experienced was transparency. Asterisk, asterisk, in April 1942. Japanese naval intelligence in Tokyo began planning Operation Mitha, invasion of Midway Atoll. The planning was meticulous by Japanese standards. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of Pearl Harbor, conceived me as a trap. He would seize Midway, a strategic atoll northwest of Hawaii, and when the American carriers sorted to defend it, he would annihilate them in decisive battle. For months, Yamamoto had sought this confrontation. He knew, as many Japanese officers knew, that Japan's resource base could not sustain a long war against American industrial might. Victory required destroying America's carrier force quickly, forcing a negotiated peace before American factories could construct the overwhelming numbers that would inevitably crush Japan. The plan involved extraordinary complexity. Multiple fleet elements, an invasion force, a carrier strike force, diversionary attacks on the Aleutian Islands, a main body built around battleships including Yamamoto's flagship, untold, coordinating across thousands of miles of ocean. The operational orders ran to hundreds of pages. Times, dates, coordinates, radio call signs, refueling schedules, aircraft complements, ammunition loadings, even the compositions of invasion forces down to the numbers of construction troops. All of this information flowed through encrypted channels using JN25 and in Pearl Harbor. In that smoke-filled basement, Rochefort's team read it. Not everything, their percentage of recovery hovered around 20 to 30% by late April, but enough. They knew something large was being planned. They knew it involved an objective designated AF. They knew carriers would be involved. They knew approximately when. The pieces accumulated like raindrops filling a barrel, each message adding fractional increments of clarity until, suddenly, the picture resolved. The Japanese could not imagine this was happening. Their operational security seemed tight. Messages were kept brief. Codes were changed regularly. The additives that super-encrypted the basic code groups were replaced every few months. Yet what they failed to grasp was the sheer scale of American effort. The British at Bletchley Park were sharing intelligence on Japanese systems. The Melbourne-based code-breaking unit, working on Japanese Army ciphers, provided insights into cipher machinery that applied across services. Washington's OPT, despite sometimes difficult relations with Station HYPO, has contributed resources and personnel. The Americans were attacking JN25 with an institutional weight that the Japanese, for all their tactical brilliance, had not anticipated any nation could bring. To bear against mathematical abstractions, there exists a particular irony in the Japanese confidence in JN25. Japanese cryptanalysts had themselves achieved remarkable successes against Allied codes in the years before the war. They had broken British diplomatic ciphers. They had read Chinese military communications with ease. This success bred an assumption of parity that because Japanese codebreakers could defeat enemy systems, the enemy must be working at similar levels of sophistication. What they missed was the industrial dimension of American cryptanalysis. Where Japan assigned hundreds to code-breaking efforts, America was mobilizing thousands. Where Japanese cryptanalysts worked with manual methods and limited tabulating equipment, Americans were beginning to employ IBM punch card machines to sort and analyze cipher groups at speeds impossible for human operators. ***, by late April, the intelligence picture emerging from decrypted Japanese messages was detailed enough to constitute genuine foreknowledge. Rochefort's team had identified the major units assigned to Operation Me. They had pinpointed the approximate timing early June. They knew carriers would strike Midway in a dawn attack, followed by invasion. But one critical ambiguity remained: the objective designator AF. Japanese messages referred constantly to AF. But what was AF? Hawaii? Midway? Some other target entirely? The fate of the coming battle hung on this single question. It was here that American intelligence executed one of history's most elegant deceptions operations. If AF was Midway, the island's garrison could send a false message in plain language, reporting a water shortage. The island's desalination plant had broken down. This message would be broadcast without encryption, seemingly an innocent administrative communication. If Japanese intelligence intercepted it and subsequently referenced it in encrypted traffic, Station HYPO would see a message about AF reporting water problems. The correlation would be unmistakable. The operation was executed in late April. Midway sent its plain language distress call about water. Within 2 days, Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF was running short of fresh water. The pieces locked together. AF was Midway. The target was confirmed. The trap Yamamoto was setting had become a trap set for him. What happened next reveals the gulf between what Japanese officers assumed about American capabilities and the reality they faced. Japanese planning for Operation Me proceeded with the confidence of men who believed their movements were hidden. The strike force, commanded by Vice Admiral Nagumo Kicha, the same man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbors, sailed eastward from Japan with 4 fleet carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, these were the elite of the Japanese carrier force, veterans of 6 months of nearly unbroken victory. Their air crews were the finest Japan possessed, pilots with thousands of hours of training, veterans of combat in China and across the Pacific. As Nagumo's carriers approached Midway in early June, the admiral operated under intelligence assessments suggesting American carriers were either in the South Pacific or undergoing repairs. The possibility that American carriers might be waiting in ambush north of Midway apparently never received serious consideration. This was not mere arrogance. It was a failure of imagination born from success. The Japanese Navy's intelligence section, despite its technical competence in some areas, had developed systematic blind spots. Japanese naval intelligence estimated that the Yorktown, badly damaged in the Battle of Coral Sea in May, would require months of repairs. In fact, Pearl Harbor's shipyards had repaired her in 72 hours of around-the-clock work. Japanese intelligence believed American carrier doctrine required lengthy preparation before sorties. In fact, Admiral Nimitz had ordered his carriers to see the moment Station HYPO confirmed the Midway target. The Japanese conception of American naval operations was frozen in pre-war patterns, unable to adapt to the reality of an enemy fighting for survival. The Americans, waiting northeast of Midway on the morning of June 4th, possessed an advantage so overwhelming that it remains difficult to convey without sounding hyperbolic. Admiral Fletcher on the Yorktown and Admiral Spruance commanding Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet knew not merely that Japanese carriers were approaching Midway, they knew approximately when, from which direction, with what strength. While Japanese search planes were still trying to locate the American fleet, American commanders were positioning their carriers for a counterstrike. The element that had made carrier warfare so uncertain, the terrifying problem of finding enemy ships in oceanic immensity, had been partially solved before the battle began. Japanese pilots taking off from their carriers at dawn to strike Midway did so believing they faced only island-based aircraft and anti-aircraft guns. They did not know that American torpedo bombers and dive bombers were already being spotted on carrier decks hundreds of miles to their northeast. They did not know that their radio transmissions reporting enemy carriers sighted were being intercepted and understood in real time. They did not know that the defensive posture their carriers assumed after recovering aircraft from the Midway, strike hangars full of armed aircraft, fuel lines snaking across decks. Ordnance carts positioned for rapid rearming had been induced by American knowledge and timing. When American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown screamed down through broken clouds at approximately 10-20-5 on the morning of June 4th, they caught the Japanese carriers at the moment of maximum vulnerability. This was not luck. It was the convergence of accurate intelligence, aggressive timing, and tactical flexibility. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, upped it in flames within 5 minutes. The 4th Hiryu launched a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown before herself being destroyed that afternoon. In one day, Japan lost 4 carriers and many of the veteran pilots and aircrew who had formed the core of the Kido-Butai's striking power. The strategic initiative in the Pacific War passed from Japanese to American hands. Japanese officers witnessing this catastrophe struggled to comprehend what had happened. Nagumo, rescued from the burning Akagi, would spend the remainder of his life haunted by June 4th. How had the Americans known to position carriers precisely where they needed to be? How had American aircraft appeared at the exact moment of Japanese vulnerability? In the immediate aftermath, explanations centered on tactical failures, inadequate search patterns, delayed attack coordination, poor defensive formations. These were real factors, but they were symptoms, not causes. The underlying reality was something Japanese commanders did not suspect and would not fully understand until after the war. The Americans had been reading their mail. The symbolic object that runs through this story is not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but something more abstract, the intercept. those sheets of paper covered in 5-digit groups, accumulated by the thousands in filing cabinets at Station HYPO, represented a fundamentally different kind of abundance than the material wealth America would soon pour into the Pacific. This was intellectual abundance, organizational abundance. The Japanese had built a superb carrier fleet, trained elite air crews, developed sophisticated naval aviation doctrine. They had achieved material excellence in the domains they understood as military power. What they had not anticipated was an enemy who would attack not just their ships and planes, but the very fabric of their communications, who would mobilize hundreds of brilliant minds for the sole purpose of reading secrets in archives. There. Survived the actual decrypt sheets from Station HYPO, yellowed now. Typed on onion skin paper and purple ink, the color designated for special intelligence derived from code breaking. Reading these documents today induces a peculiar vertigo. Here are Japanese operational orders. It's often accompanied by annotations in Rochefort's handwriting translations. Interpretations. Cross-references to other messages. The pages capture a moment when information moved from hidden to known, when Japanese plans ceased being secret and became intelligence. Each sheet represents hours of cryptanalytic labor, but also something larger, the transformation of uncertainty into foreknowledge. The Japanese never changed. JN25 after Midway, in any fundamental way. They altered additives, introduced new code groups, modified procedures, but they continued to believe the system was secure. Its failure to recognize compromise remains one of the war's great mysteries. After Midway, after the Yamamoto shoot-down in 1943, when American P-38s, guided by decrypted flight information, killed the admiral over Bougainville, after repeated instances where American forces showed impossible foreknowledge, Japanese naval officers apparently never concluded that their ciphers had been broken. Instead, they blamed spies, lucky reconnaissance, radar which they believed Americans possessed in greater sophistication than was actually the case. This psychological phenomenon speaks to something deeper than mere oversight. It reveals the difficulty of accepting that one's fundamental assumptions about security might be wrong, that the mathematical fortress one believed impregnable had been breached. American cryptanalysts continued reading Japanese naval communications throughout the war. The intelligence derived from these decrypts, codenamed ULTRA in reference to its classification level, shaped virtually every major operation in the Pacific theater. Submarine commanders received decrypted merchant shipping routes, allowing them to intercept convoys with devastating efficiency. Surface commanders knew Japanese fleet movements, often before Japanese subordinate officers did. The island hopping campaign that drove across the Central Pacific from 1943 through 1945 was planned with detailed knowledge of Japanese garrison strengths. Supply situations, reinforcement schedules, all gleaned from intercepted communications. The men and women who made this possible remained silent. During the war, they could not speak of their work. After the war, when a few details began to emerge, most stayed quiet nonetheless. The culture of signals intelligence demanded permanent secrecy. Rochefort returned from Pearl Harbor to relative obscurity, his achievements known only to a small circle within Navy intelligence. He would not receive proper recognition until decades after the war. Agnes Driscoll retired without public acknowledgement of her pioneering work. The thousands of linguists, cryptanalysts, clerks, typists, machine operators, the vast institutional apparatus that sustained American code breaking, faded back into civilian life, carrying secrets they would take to their graves. This silence meant that the Japanese understanding of what had happened at Midway remained incomplete for years. Japanese naval histories written in the immediate post-war period focused on tactical decisions and material factors. Only gradually, as American histories began revealing the intelligence dimension in the 1960s and 1970s, did the full picture emerge. For Japanese veterans who had fought at Midway, the revelation must have carried a peculiar horror, the realization that the battle they had analyzed and reanalyzed for decades, searching for tactical lessons, had been shaped by an invisible factor they had never suspected. Asterisk, there is a broader truth embedded in this story, one that transcends the specific circumstances of Midway. The Japanese entered the Pacific War with certain assumptions about the nature of conflict, that military power resided primarily in ships, aircraft, troops, and the warrior spirit of those who wielded them. These were not foolish assumptions. They were the assumptions of virtually every military power before the Second World War. What Japan encountered was an enemy who attacked across a wider spectrum than they had anticipated. America brought material abundance, the ships, the planes, the industrial output, but also institutional abundance, the ability to mobilize entire categories of national effort toward war aims. Codebreaking required mathematicians, linguists, engineers, administrators, typists, clerks, thousands of people, most of whom never approached combat, but whose cumulative effort created strategic effects as decisive as any battle. The shock Japanese officers experienced was not merely tactical surprise at Midway. It was the deeper shock of discovering that their mental model of warfare was incomplete. They had prepared for a conflict of steel and fire, of ships maneuvering and aircraft diving. They found themselves in a conflict that also operated in abstract realms in mathematics, in information theory, in the systematic exploitation of enemy communications. This was not the war they had studied or the war they had trained to fight. Asterisk. Asterisk, in a cramped radio interception room on a windswept atoll, years after Pearl Harbor's fires had been extinguished. The typewriters still clattered. Asterisk, asterisk, new generations of cryptanalysts worked against new Japanese codes. The fundamentals remained unchanged: patient analysis, pattern recognition, the grinding intellectual labor of converting encrypted chaos into readable intelligence. By war's end, American signals intelligence had become a vast enterprise, employing tens of thousands, operating globally, reading not just Japanese communications, but German and Italian as well. The basement operation at Pearl Harbor had metastasized into an institutional colossus. Yet the essential vulnerability that made all this possible was never purely technical. JN25 was not a weak cipher by 1940 standards. Given time and resources, any code can theoretically be broken. But the practical difficulty of breaking JN25 within operationally useful timeframes should have been prohibitive. What made it possible was volume. The Japanese transmitted thousands of messages daily: administrative traffic, logistical arrangements, routine position reports, weather data, personnel transfers. Each message was a piece of evidence. Each repeated phrase was a crib. Each stereotyped formatting convention was a handhold for cryptanalysts. The bureaucratic thoroughness of the Japanese military establishment, its need to document and communicate constantly, created the statistical foundation for its own undoing. There is poetry in this irony that organizational efficiency and thoroughness, virtues in almost any context, became liabilities when combined with compromised communications security. The Japanese Navy was competent, professional, disciplined. It maintained excellent operational records. It communicated clearly between echelons. All these strengths, in the presence of sophisticated signals intelligence, transformed into weaknesses. Meanwhile, American cryptanalysts, working in basement rooms thick with cigarette smoke, operating on too little sleep and too much coffee, converted Japanese virtues into American advantages. The epilogue to this story stretches across decades. Midway was followed by Guadalcanal, by the island campaigns, by the slow, bloody advance across the Pacific. At each stage, ultra-intelligence played a role, sometimes decisive, sometimes merely contributory, but always present. Japanese officers continued planning operations, transmitting orders, coordinating movements, never quite grasping that their enemy was reading along. After the war, when the veil of secrecy began to lift, Japanese veterans expressed not anger, but a kind of bewildered admiration. How had the Americans done it? What techniques had they used? Could Japan have done the same, had circumstances been different? These questions miss a deeper point. American success in signals intelligence was not primarily a story of individual genius, though genius was certainly present. It was a story of mobilization, of recognizing that warfare in the industrial age required the systematic application of intellectual resources on a scale never before attempted. It was a story of democratic abundance turned toward war aims, of a nation pulling mathematicians from universities, linguists from missionary schools, engineers from private industry, and organizing them into an apparatus designed to steal enemy secrets. Asterisk, asterisk, the freedom to mobilize resources on this scale, to coordinate efforts across agencies and services, despite bureaucratic friction, to attract talent through appeals to duty rather than compulsion. This was democracy's unexpected advantage. Asterisk, asterisk, Japanese military planners had anticipated American material advantages. They knew American factories could outproduce Japanese industry. What they had not anticipated was that American institutional flexibility, the very pluralism and decentralization they viewed as weakness, could generate advantages in asymmetric domains like code breaking. When Admiral Daidumo stood on Akagi's bridge as flames consumed his flagship, when Japanese pilots struggled to escape their burning aircraft, when damage control parties fought hopeless battles against uncontrollable fires, they were experiencing not just defeat, but the collision of their expectations with an unanticipated reality. They had expected a naval battle fought on terms they understood. They got a naval battle shaped by an intelligence dimension they had not imagined possible. The shock was not merely that they lost. Wars contain winners and losers, and professional militaries accept this. The shock was that they had lost while fighting blind against an enemy who saw in the decades since. Midway has been analyzed as a turning point, the moment when Japanese expansion reached its limit, when the Pacific War's trajectory shifted from Japanese offense to American advance. This analysis is correct as far as it goes, but the deeper turning point was informational, not material. It occurred in those basement rooms months before the battle. When American cryptanalysts first began recovering meaningful percentages of JN-25, when the possibility emerged that Japanese secrets might become American intelligence, the battle was the manifestation. The intelligence breakthrough was the cause, and so the papers remain. Preserved in archives, those sheets of purple-ink decrypts that captured Japanese plans and converted them to American foreknowledge. They are artifacts of a particular moment in warfare's evolution, when conflicts began operating simultaneously, in physical and informational domains, when the ability to read enemy communications became as decisive as the ability to sink enemy ships. Japanese officers were shocked at Midway, not because they underestimated American courage or tactical skill. They were shocked because they discovered too late the war they were fighting was larger and stranger than the war they had prepared for. They had brought excellence to a known game and discovered their opponent was playing a different game. It's entirely one where information was ammunition, where patience was weaponized, and where the most decisive battles were fought by people who never saw combat, who never fired shots, who waged war with pencils and probability theory and inexhaustible patience. This was the truth democracy wrote in cipher traffic and decoded messages. That abundance takes many forms. That institutional depth can outweigh tactical brilliance. And that wars are won not merely by those who fight best, but by those who understand most completely the full dimensions of the contest they have entered. The Japanese Navy learned this truth in fire and defeat. The lesson written in the burning carriers at Midway remained unread in its fullest implications until long after the war ended. By then, the men and women who had written it were scattered, silent, and content to let history speak in their place.